If you can engineer it, you can reverse engineer it. Hi there, I'm Mark Seeley. Welcome to Pandemic Masterplan. We are at a fascinating crossroads in human history where a centuries-old plan for the transition of countries around the world to the New World Order is now in full swing. Nothing this significant has happened to humanity since WW1 and WW2. It prompted me to write the book WW3, and you thought it was a pandemic. We are about to demonstrate the narrative is adapting to the plan and not the other way around. So it's time to take a look at what's in store for us ahead in the larger picture using tools of good old-fashioned engineering and project management. This is the fifth video in the series that builds on the context established in Well, Is That Right? An analysis of geopolitical analyses, a fish story, on cracking the code, and just how I felt. So far, we have suggested that the general public resides within a bubble of protocol that is somewhat divorced from reality, and this has opened the door for a cabal of higher elites to manage us to their advantage while they work hard to keep us in that bubble. With the pandemic as our project, here we will be setting out the objective for the pandemic, the work breakdown structure for the pandemic, the master schedule for the pandemic, and the critical path for the pandemic. That will help us answer the question, will they meet their 2030 deadline? We will address Agenda 2030, the starting point for our pandemic project that was subtly signed in place in 2015, that uses the pandemic as the pretext for transitioning us from capitalism to socialism. As regular injections are now required to maintain a modicum of your civil liberty, and given the mRNA content, we are now transitioning humanity to a digital conversion. Like those Bill Gates software updates for your computer, you will now have digital updates to yourself as and when the center desires. With the transition all but assured, let's position current events to within the overall plan. Here we will address 1. The objective, 2. The work breakdown structure, 3. The master schedule, 4. The critical path that will pace the progress in our transition, and 5. Conclusion. Part 1. The objective. Consistent with both sound engineering and project management practice, it's important that we firstly anchor our pandemic project in a purpose that sufficiently describes outcomes that will determine success. For the pandemic project, the objective is to transition society to the New World Order. This new orientation in our governance will, once and for all, overtake democracy at the national and state levels to convert our societies from capitalism to socialism under the direction of the project sponsor. Success will be determined by completing the conversion with buy-in in sufficient numbers to sustain the plan by the allotted 2030 deadline. The various components that will be addressed in the next section are to be realized on schedule while respecting their network relationships, i.e. activity precedence. The plan currently in play originated in the 1700s under a study commissioned by the Rothschilds banking family, heirs of which today head up the Commonwealth Club of Rome, our sponsors for the project. First World War was to enable the New World Order organization called the League of Nations, which was installed in 1924. However, our forebears kicked the living out of that idea, and the League of Nations failed. Not taking defeat lightly, the project sponsors held World War II that then reinvigorated the plan under the United Nations, installed in 1946. Now, learning a lesson from the League of Nations fiasco, the successor installation laid fairly dormant until 1992, where Agenda 21 was quietly signed into being by 172 countries. The effort, spearheaded by the sponsor's man in the field and President of the United States, George Herbert Walker Bush, didn't register with the average information consumer. Agenda 21 set out the basis for bringing the New World Order into being in the 21st century, which is where we are now. Fast forwarding in 2015, that plan was refined to Agenda 2030, ratified by 196 countries. This left the sponsor and our elected leadership inductees a mere 15 years to complete the work. In addition to the global warming preparatory work, we needed a pandemic to instill the impetus for society to drop everything to lose everything. Preparatory work was completed in Africa and in India, and 170 patents were filed on a virus that the public hadn't yet heard of. At pandemic launch in 2020, there only remained a 10-year lead time to project completion. Part 2, the Work Breakdown Structure, or WBS. The summary level WBS includes the following activities required for success. These are arranged in broad categories of focus. However, as you will see, they feature a number of cross connections that will be important consideration when we work on scheduling and determining the critical path in the following sections. This will explain why the pandemic is continuing and how long it will have to continue to enable the components to fall into place. So our pandemic project is broken down to the following 8 high-level work elements as follows: governance, biodigital conversion, income adaptation, equity withdrawal, control framework, supply chain, digital currency, depopulation. Item 1.1. Governance entails setting in place the buy-in of key leaders and institutions to enable the pandemic phase of the transition. Firstly and foremostly, it is important that we cross the Great Divide. Through the UN machinations, your government is not yours. Sub-activities here include G7 formulations, Agenda 2030 sign-off, World Economic Forum and its Great Reset, media control, social media filtering, fact-checking, the pandemic, U.S. election adjustment. Item 1.2, biodigital conversion, entails causing the public to accept mandatory mRNA adjustments through injection. Sub-elements here include the pandemic, the waves and variants prolongation, lockdowns, injections, wellness passport to latch society to repeated injection. Item 1.3, income adaptation, entails reverting remuneration from free market jobs to state-run financial dependency under the impending socialism, with the level of remuneration to be based on contribution to the sponsor's objectives. Sub-elements here include the pandemic, the race war, the lockdowns, Build Back Better, Green New Deal, universal income, equity tax. Item 1.4, equity withdrawal, entails hampering and reducing the public's capital holdings and right to own capital. Sub-activities here include the pandemic, the lockdown to expand bankruptcy, global warming, carbon tax, equity tax, land ownership rules, penalties, and restrictions. Item 1.5, control framework, entails implementation of a real-time tracking of individual mobility and contact tracing. Here, the individual's permitted mobility will be regulated based on the criteria to be established by the sponsor. Sub-activities here include the pandemic, the lockdowns, injection to establish the chip profile, contact tracing, 5G network completion for tracking. Item 1.6, supply chain adjustment, entails reverting from small-medium enterprises that enable supply to the public to Amazon, and with this, a restriction of the nature and quantity of items permitted for supply. Criteria will be established by the sponsor. Sub-activities here include the pandemic, lockdown bankruptcy, Amazon construction. Item 1.7, digital currency, entails reverting to the new international currency drawn from the International Monetary Fund that will be managed and tracked online. Sub-activities here include pandemic, lockdowns, federal debt expansion, Green New Deal. Item 1.8, depopulation, entails right-sizing the population by region based on criteria to be determined by the sponsor. Sub-activities here include the injections to adjust fertility and hormone level, the Delta and Lambda variants, promotion of gender neutrality ambiguity, the LGBTQM movement, construction of internment camps for dissenters, arrest and detention of dissenters. Part 3, the master schedule. The project in question, the pandemic, is situated within a larger program called the New World Order, as mentioned earlier. The larger program was initiated in 1770 and contains major milestones that include WW1 and WW2, the signing of Agenda 21 in 1992, and the 2010 Rockefeller Study on a Pandemic, and finally the signing of Agenda 2030 in 2015. This is the starting point for our schedule for the pandemic project. The pandemic project schedule included 5 years of preparatory work prior to the implementation that the broader public was not brought into, with major milestones that included vaccination and wellness passport trials in Africa and vaccination and passport trials in India, various PR pieces relating to mass pandemics such as Bill Gates' 2010 TED Talks, the filing of 170 patents for SARS-CoV-2 and its detection methods, and finally Bill Gates' Event 201 in 2019 that brought the planning phase to a close. The go live we have indicated as January 2020. So in building the master schedule, we of course need to take note of the task durations and any precedents to the tasks and events. However, a key pacing criteria will be what we referred to earlier as the boiling frog syndrome. Bringing people forward on an agenda that is not in their interest takes time. This is the wild card, the public's propensity to faithfully accept the narrative. If steps appear too abruptly, the public will wake up and revolt. Hence, slow and steady wins the race. Having said that, as of pandemic initiation, the sponsor only left a 10-year lead time to the deadline with a lot of major steps ahead. Now keep in mind the boiling frog aspect is more critical at the earlier phases of the program, as achievement of interstitial milestones will latch successor events into place. For example, the ease of ratcheting up injections once the wellness passports are introduced. Loosely respecting precedents and activity durations, the schedule for governance is this. Similarly, the schedule for bio to digital conversion looks like this. The schedule for income adaptation looks like this. The schedule for equity withdrawal looks like this. The schedule for the control framework looks like this. The schedule for the supply chain adjustment looks like this. The schedule for digital currency looks like this. The schedule for depopulation looks like this. Now, the positioning of the various sub-elements of our work breakdown structure on the schedule timeline is based on precedent and the relationship within the engineering network. As the catalyst for our transition, the pandemic cannot be simply introduced and withdrawn in short order. It will take the full 10 years of the implementation phase, hence the expanding waves and variants. Part 4, the critical path. So an obvious question, will they be able to meet 2030? Unfortunately for them, that very much depends on you. So far, public uptake has been, how should I say, boisterous. Now, putting the various components together to respect the precedents and the interconnections of the various activities and their sub-activities produces a rather busy mosaic. Running through each of the high-level WBS elements, we can note critical path drivers, the sub-activities that are likely to drive schedule. I'll do this in a rather matter-of-factual Machiavellian-style delivery. Governance is in place and appears to be clear sailing, apart from the legal challenges to rights and liberties that will drive schedule based on procedural time to quash these in the courts. Biodigital conversion is underway, but will be hampered by the conflict between the two-shot narrative that is currently on the table to assure program inductees while simultaneously needing to expand to the greater number for full conversion. Also, the side effects of the injections must be carefully suppressed. The wellness passport will similarly require procedural time for elimination of court challenges. Income adaptation is schedule driven by the time interval to bankruptcy. Entrepreneurs thinking we are going back to normal will double down on a poor investment to maintain their businesses, which will drag out the time interval to bankruptcy. The equity tax component will likely consume procedural time in the courts before challenges are quashed. For equity withdrawal, the equity tax and the land ownership question will definitely require significant procedural time in the courts to manage dissension. Schedule for the control framework element will be primarily driven by public uptake in increased injections sufficient to gain the chip profile and by the status of the 5G network, installation of which is being accelerated to intercept wellness passport installation. The wellness passport itself will require procedural time with the courts to quash dissension. The supply chain appears to be on schedule, with Amazon constructions nearly completing in most major centers. Shortages in traditional supply lines will be created to cause the switch to Amazon and will also be contingent on the pace of those planned small business failures. The digital currency element is extensively driven by the elites in the banking industry that are vested in the current system. Schedule will be driven by the time to achieve their consensus on the right time to throw the switch. Depopulation is the natural product of the injection regimes and will be schedule driven by injection uptake. Time will be required to coerce the public on side and to demonize anyone not participating. The internment camp sub-element provides a clear-cut example of precedence. Issuing the contract for the internment camps must obviously precede opening of the internment camps to detain dissenters. Sound project management practice will uncover how long before we have the problem we didn't anticipate we need to act to prepare for something we didn't know we needed. Now someone's planning ahead. Now, with the evident crowding and compression of events in the mid to latter phases, we should anticipate the sponsor will have to aggressively pick up the pace in forcing through the balance of the requirements to meet 2030 through a ramping up of aggression. As things intensify, the credibility for the reviewing public will strain significantly. This balancing act will perhaps be the sponsor's greatest issue and is probably keeping them up at night. Given that a woken public will turn on their leadership, there are two prospective risk mitigation features that could bear on schedule. The first would be to stop the program at an appropriate significant milestone, for example, installation of the wellness passport. They can then dial back the pace for installing the balance of the program and extend completion beyond 2030. A second mitigating option would be to revert to a hot war to divert attention from the fracturing psyop. A third option might be to throw some of the program instigators, such as Gates and Fauci, under the bus in hopes that this will avoid a lynching. Conclusion. What we are witnessing today is ostensibly World War III for the installation of the New World Order, following over a century of central planning. The pandemic is the launch vehicle. Whereas the First and Second Wars were hot wars in which nation was pitted against nation to achieve the center's plan, World War III, at least so far, is a psyop that pits the public against their governments. Trusted leaders who are actually vanguards for the controlling central authority. Your elected leaders have become central authority inductees in return for favorable treatment in the centrally controlled media. This is what today's democracy has reduced to, a central impressioneering amidst a sea of media propaganda. The problem in this happy central collaboration is the impracticality in bringing societies around the world forward on a plan that is to leave the center with everything and leave the public with nothing. Hence, structured disaster becomes essential to societies willingly walking into the light. as demonstrated here in the public interest, is consistently being adapted to the plan rather than the plan being adapted to the public interest. The cart is quite evidently before the horse. The virus is continuing to mutate to the precise lockstep of Agenda 2030 installation, and under the current plan won't go away until 2030. By 2030, you are to own nothing and be happy. This is where Build Back Better is taking you. As the jab question continues to divide the community into the two camps, those going along with it and those not. Unfortunately, this merely establishes two camps of losers, those who will lose everything today and those who will lose everything tomorrow. By everything, I mean your capital, your liberty, and your health. Of course, today we are witnessing leaders' narratives becoming strained as we progress through their plan. As the 2030 deadline for the completion of the pandemic transition looms closer, ambition increases. The logic becomes convoluted. Credibility of the narration wavers and then falls apart, laying bare your leader's role as little more than a salesman for the center's wares. Unfortunately, manipulation under WW1 and WW2 demonstrated the worst in human nature, where individual choice to consume comforting propaganda overtook personal responsibility. Under WW3, with the propaganda intensifying, the worst in human nature is once again coming home to roost. The carnage in what we will do to each other in the years ahead is likely to be worse than the other two wars combined. The price of submission, I guess. The only arrow in the minority's quiver is the truth, a deadly concept that can readily cut through the oppressor's propaganda. For the public interest, the solution is critical thinking. Forget the word pandemic and substitute in its place Agenda 2030. Then continue with the discussions. Oh, and for your own sake, turn off that mainstream media machine. Thanks very much for listening. This is Mark Seeley, and on behalf of Dan Carrier saying, take care and be safe. Bye for now.